As I stand listening to Bill Ayers, I realize that we have some agreements, but we also have a lot of disagreements. And it's a puzzle to me about how that can be so. How can two people who are both in America, looking at the same facts in front of them, come to such radically different assessments about America? I think one of the reasons for this is because, not just because there's a generational divide between Ayers and me. He's, in some ways, no, I just mean this, that Ayers came of age in the 60s. I came of the age in the 80s. I'm a young Reaganite, if you will. That's part of the difference between us, but a bigger part, I think, is that I'm an immigrant who grew up in a different culture. Being an immigrant exposes you to some other way of life. And the immigrant coming to America is always comparing America to some other existing country. The immigrant, in other words, is using a comparative or historical standard. Ayers is comparing America, I would say, to the Garden of Eden. In other words, he's using a utopian standard, and obviously by that utopian standard, America falls short. So one reason for the difference between the immigrant point of view and the native point of view is the native point of view is utopian, which is to say it lives in unreality. Now, as I think about my own life, I came to the United States with $500 in my pocket. I came to America not knowing what to expect. And I discovered in America this bizarre thing, the American dream. And the American dream is not just the idea of economic success. That's often what it is misinterpreted to be. I have a friend in Bombay, India, who's always telling me he's been trying to come to America. He goes, Dinesh, I really want to move to a country where the poor people are fat. And that's the materialistic view of American success. But for me, I grew up in a middle-class family, and although my life is materially better in America, that difference is not radical. My life has actually changed more in other ways. The most important thing that America has given me is the opportunity to be the architect of my own destiny, to be in the driver's seat of my own life. This is a country in which your major decisions, where to live, whom to love, whom to marry, what to believe, what to become, those are decisions that you, the individual, make for yourself.
Dinesh, does Richard have a point here that Trump didn't do anything to quell those individuals whose voices may be representative by the white supremacy movement and others? What do you say to that?
Well, this kind of white supremacy allegation is part of the modern democratic playbook. I remember in 1980, people dragged out 5 toothless white supremacists and said to Reagan, you know, you're catering to white supremacy. You can look at these guys, they've endorsed you. And Reagan said, well, you notice that they may have endorsed me, but I haven't endorsed them. And I think this is the key issue, that the Democratic Party historically has been the party of white supremacy. All the institutions of white supremacy, from slavery to segregation, the Ku Klux Klan, lynching, these were created, promoted, and sustained by the Democratic Party. From the WikiLeaks revelations, we see that Democrats even now talk privately about blacks, about Hispanics, even about Catholics, in a way that you never see Republicans talk. There's nothing equivalent on the Republican side. So this is a scapegoat to try to explain an election result that is very embarrassing for the Democratic Party. They had more money, they had the organization, the Republican Party was divided, and still Trump won. That leaves these guys with a lot of explaining to do.
Do you believe, if I can ask you a direct question, that you are the beneficiary of white privilege here at Amherst? Yes or no?
Well, yeah, and
Pause.
Okay.
If you are, can I ask you a further question?
Oh, okay, yeah, but I don't just.
Here's where I'm getting with this, okay? One of the benefits of a good education of reading people like Nietzsche is you begin to understand how deep the human desire is for moral self-exculpation. Moral self-exculpation. Now, you say, and I didn't say this, you said this, I'm a beneficiary of illicit white privilege. Okay?
Illicit?
Well, isn't all white privilege illicit? Is it deserved?
Well, in this current system, there is legality. I mean,
illicit means immoral.
Okay, then
immoral white privilege.
Yeah.
Okay. So then if I were to say to you, there are surely many deserving minorities who would like to come to Amherst but have the inherited disadvantage of American history. Therefore, since you are an acknowledged beneficiary of illicit privilege, would you be willing to step aside voluntarily, putting your own moral mouth where your self-proclaimed virtue is, and give your seat, not my seat. I realize you may be super generous with other people's advantages and favor affirmative action, so other white kids who apply to Amherst are turned away to open spaces for minorities. But I'm not talking about you acting out your virtue on them. I'm talking about you acting out your virtue on you. Are you willing to give up your illicit seat that you don't deserve here at Amherst to make room for a disadvantaged minority? Yes or no?
Okay, well, let me start here. I don't know how you got on the topic of affirmative action.
By following the logic of your...
No, I never said specifically that I think that race-based affirmative action is the best way to rectify the systems of injustice that...
Why don't you practice it by stepping out? And why don't you go to the registrar tomorrow and tell him you want to withdraw from Amherst?
Are you listening to what he just said to you? Get on.
Yeah.
I'm listening.
Think about it.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, I mean, look, I'm only continuing to engage because you continue to engage with me, and I do want to hear other people's questions. But in response to that, again, what you're trying to demonstrate is that everyone's hypocritical. As someone once said, that we're all dirty up to our arms, right? We're not all perfect. None of us is perfectly morally consistent. Now, I've said absolutely nothing about affirmative action. The fact is that I believe everyone in this room is hypocritical to some degree. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive for a more just and equitable system entirely. There have been points in my life in which I have given up some of the privileges with which I have been endowed simply because I realized that it wasn't the right thing to do. At the same time, I think everyone needs to survive, and that we understand that we exist in an imperfect system, and that we have to conduct our business in such a way as to not only adhere to our moral standards, but to the standards imposed upon us by the system in which we live. And I think that we have to be generous to people in their efforts to not be hypocritical and to do their best. But I don't think that we should totally throw away the idea that we shouldn't have those standards at all. So that's my response to you, but I would still like a response to my question regarding the inequity that I talked about with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. That is wealth that is passed down, and it's documentable wealth. The same way that the wealth created, or the wealth stolen as a product of slavery, was also documentable wealth. We have numbers that demonstrate precisely how much wealth was stolen, and that's money that in some way could be given back. Now, if we're saying that it's absolutely impossible to give that money back because it's too hard to trace, we'd have to give money to the African tribes, we'd have to give money to people who no longer exist. That's absolutely fine, but we have to understand that we haven't really come to terms with that injustice that's been perpetrated. And if we are admitting that no one is perfectly entitled to absolutely everything that their ancestors had stolen from them, then we also have to accept that there are people today who benefit from the fact that their parents and grandparents profited from this immoral system. And the way to deal with that is with a social safety net that enables everyone to thrive. I'll leave you there.
Yes. Well, the core of the American system, this will actually answers your question directly, is that what do we do about the conquest ethic of the past? And here there are two options. There are two options. One option is we establish equal rights under the law. That was the solution of the civil rights movement, that we have had race-based discrimination, we've had racial hierarchy. Let's stop. Let's treat people according to the color of this, according to the content of their character. Equal rights under the law. Equal rights under the law. The other option, which you're defending, is you could essentially call it, let's correct for history. Let's correct for history. Let's try to find out who are the people in possession of stolen goods, and let's return it. Now, the first thing I'm trying to say is, this is a hugely controversial principle because it actually involves wrecking the freedom of a free society. You basically have to put it frankly, we were to carry that out, go into people's homes and take their stuff, take their furniture, take their cars. You don't seem to have even the guts to do that. You don't have the moral self-confidence to do it yourself. It may be, if I am advocating a rule of social justice and I'm advocating it for the whole society, before I persuade everybody else, let's say I'm a Christian and I believe everybody should give 10% of their wealth to help the poor. And I go, you know what? The Bible says this, the Bible says that, everybody should give 10% of their wealth to help the poor. And somebody says, Dinesh, are you giving 10% of your wealth? And I'm like, actually no, but I did do some tutoring. And you go, wait a minute, aren't you advocating, aren't you saying that there is a moral duty to do this? Why don't you do it? Before you convince us, you do it. And you're like, I don't think I should do it because society is extremely complex, and I don't think I should do it unless everybody else does it. No, either you believe in it and you do it. Once you've done it, you might impress us. And then you might convince the rest of us that our wealth is also ill-gotten. But you can't do it. And I'm not trying to indict everybody of hypocrisy, only you. Because you're the one who said, I'm the beneficiary of illicit privilege. So you're a really good starting point, because I'm asking, if you're in possession of stolen goods, why aren't you willing to return them? So that's why fundamentally I see your charity. You know, during the Civil War, there was a guy who goes, I'm very happy to give, I've given 3 cousins to the war and I'm ready to sacrifice my wife's brother. That's basically your ethics. You're willing to have social justice if other people pay, but you're not willing to pay. So that's the problem. And that's the problem with the progressivism that marches behind social justice while protecting its own privileges. You know how you said, we all have to survive. Really? You have to be at Amherst to survive? You don't have to be at Amherst to survive. You have to be at Amherst to benefit. You have to be at Amherst because you're getting opportunities at this college that many other people are not getting. So if you say you believe in equal opportunity, you're a hypocrite, because you are taking advantage of opportunities unavailable to others. But for you, this hypocrisy is fully justified because you are militating on behalf of the poor. But if you are against privilege, this college is privilege. So there's a glaring hypocrisy, and you will never turn your moral mirror on yourself to say, what am I doing about it? That's my point. For you, society should act before you do, to enforce your moral code.
The current Democratic Party has absolutely none of those values from 50 years ago, and you're pretending that they are guilty of something. Aren't you trying to claim that Jesse Jackson is a dupe and shouldn't be supporting the Democratic Party because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican and freed the slaves?
Let me try to tackle that very frontally. First of all, probably the biggest thing going for the big switch that I mentioned earlier are 2 facts, both of which are very powerful. The first is that whites in the South, who used to be Democrats, do now predominantly vote Republican. Yep. Right? Yep. Fact number 2 is that blacks, who used to vote Republican, now vote overwhelmingly Democratic. Yep. And operating on the assumption, which I think is reasonable, that people understand where their own interests lie, it would certainly be right that blacks currently see their identification and their interest in the Democratic Party. Now, here are 2 interesting questions to ask. Number 1, when did blacks switch from being Republicans to being Democrats? The Democratic Party was the party of the Dixiecrats all the way through the 60s. And if what you say is true, that the blacks made a switch to their racial friends, it would appear that the black switch would have to come in the 70s and 80s, when blacks see these racists are now moving over there, so it makes sense for us to move over here. But in reality, blacks moved overwhelmingly to the Democratic Party in the 1930s. The black vote went from about 15% Democratic to about 70% Democratic within 4 years.
In the places they
That's right. But
Which
here,
was the North.
also in the...
Republican. Jackie Robinson was a Republican for darn good reason.
That's absolutely right. But here's what I'm getting at.
Wouldn't be today.
Well, we can debate Jackie Robinson because it's always difficult to know what dead people would say. If Martin Luther King were alive today, Martin Luther King isn't alive today. Okay, but here's the point I'm getting at. The reason that blacks switched from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party had everything to do with the benefits of the New Deal and nothing to do with racism. In fact, yes, and in the South, too, blacks switched to the Democratic Party. It's not that blacks couldn't vote in the South. It's that there were all kinds of barriers to black voting. Under FDR, there was blacks couldn't vote in the South at all. No blacks voted in the South.
Very, very few.
How many? How many?
I don't know.
Okay. I thought so. Look, there were all kinds of poll taxes and barriers imposed by the Democrats on the black vote until the Democrats realized that they could get the black vote by offering jobs, welfare, retirement programs. Are you telling me that FDR in the South was telling blacks who were voting for the Democrats, you can't vote? Not true. Not true. Blacks in the North and the South switched to the Democratic Party because of New Deal benefits. Many of them were very sad about doing it because they were leaving the party of emancipation and Lincoln and flinging themselves into the party of the Ku Klux Klan and the Dixiecrats who were in the South and were in the Democratic Party. Exactly. So what I'm saying is it was a Faustian bargain in which you get economic benefits and at the same time you're in bed with the racists and you're on your own team. And I'm saying that's American history. Now, whites began to switch to the Republican Party, but much later. Whites began to switch to the Republican Party in droves in the 70s and 80s. Now, here's the point. If you look at racial opinion in the South, and there's a voluminous body of data on this, as racism in the South dramatically declines, the Southern identification with the Republican Party begins to increase. There's an opposite track. Racism is declining in the South, and whites begin to move to the Republican Party. In fact, two scholars who've written a book about this trace that the least racist Southerners all became Republicans. That the poor white racist Democrat never became a Republican. He was a dug-in Democrat to the end of his days. So the Democratic Party remained the party of racism. And as the South became less agrarian, more prosperous, industry came to the South, the post-industrial society, the Republican appeal of equal opportunity, free markets, prosperity, appealed to Southerners, and that's why so what I'm getting at is that the progressives have sold the South on a guilt trip. Even this whole thing about, the Civil War was really about slavery and the South did slavery. Wait a minute, again, the Northern Democrats protected slavery. The Civil War, the fight over slavery was between the Democratic Party, North and South, that protected it, and the Republican Party, which only was in the North, that opposed it. That's what that fight was about. It wasn't just, the North-South thing is now a disguise to hide the responsibility of a major political party that was the party of slavery for 100 years. True or false?
The deeper part of the question is, so prove to me that the Democratic Party is racist now. And as often happens with a tough question, this is kind of when I rise to the occasion. Well, let me just say this. If one goes today to the Democratic-controlled inner city, and we're talking here about some 24 cities entirely dominated by the Democratic Party, there's not a Republican in sight. I argue that we will see in them now all the 5 features of the slave plantation that Kenneth Stamp outlined in his classic work, The Peculiar Institution. In a description of the plantation, Kenneth Stamp identifies 5 things that you would see on a slave plantation. Number 1, broken down, dilapidated, and unsafe housing. Number 2, broken families. You can see this under slavery. There was a confusion of who's the real father, mulattoes running around in the plantation, the family structure in decay. Number 3, a high degree of violence required to hold the place together. Police power, whippings, overseers, fences, barbed wire. Number 4, everybody gets a basic provision. If you need food, you have health care, they call the doctor, but nobody gets ahead. There's no opportunity. Nobody really advances. The Southerners and the Democrats used to call slavery a school of civilization. And Stamp goes, that's not a school from which anyone ever seemed to graduate. And finally, nihilism and despair. A feeling that there's no future, that this is an intergenerational, ongoing, lasting way of life. Now, all those 5 features can be traced directly to inner city Oakland, inner city Baltimore, many places, Chicago. And like I say, this has been going on since the 60s. The United States has spent trillions of dollars to fix these places. The Democrats have been in charge of fixing it. And yet, many of these places are no better off than they were in 1967. Think about that.
Hello, Mr. D'Souza. I'm an op-ed writer for the school paper, and full disclosure, I wrote an article saying that I think you're a hack. Now, I came with an open mind, and I was disappointed to find that much like much of the current president's comments, yours are based on sort of shallow logic, lack of expertise, no real facts, and economic ignorance. But, and some conservatives have said that too, but I have a question about the broader conservative philosophy, and this gets back to what you said about trade. Now, you said that, we got to, get trade back in order. But with the trend in technology nowadays, the real threat is not trade and loss of jobs overseas, but automation, artificial intelligence, the replacement of many of the jobs that serve as a starting level for economic advancement. What role does conservatism have in a world in which machines and automation can take the place of much of human labor and activity that generates income and value for everyday people?
All right, well, man, let me say this. If it is the case that in what I said tonight, and I put some fairly incendiary material on the table, if I had said something that was even arguably wrong, factually wrong, about the Democratic Party or about fascism or about Trump, it would be very easy for someone to point it out. So normally, if you're going to call someone a hack, you should kind of try to establish your own bona fides. It's okay. It's okay. Look, a certain amount of moral indignation is the staple of being a late teen. And so I think we should be indulgent. Now, technology. Look, here's the point. We have seen in the United States the ordinary working guy, I don't just mean the white guy, the black guy, the Hispanic guy, the working class in this country has been hit by 3 powerful winds blowing in the same direction. And those winds are named globalization, immigration, and technology. Now, what does the Democratic Party plan to do about any of these? And the answer is nothing. Nothing. Obama did nothing. Hillary proposed to do nothing. In fact, what the Democratic Party wants to do is to increase the problem of illegal immigration, motivated solely by getting Democratic voters, with complete indifference to the impact on the worker. Now, Trump has never spoken one word against technology. The technology boom in the United States is the product of Reagan-era policies of privatization, deregulation, the unleashing of the entrepreneur. If you don't believe me, when I came to the United States, the entrepreneur was in a funk. The guy who was riding high on the hog was the federal worker. Why? Because a generation ago, a moronic John F. Kennedy said, if you're young, if you're idealistic, do what? Join the Peace Corps. Become a public servant. an oxymoron if I ever heard one. And so the bureaucrat was made the embodiment of American idealism. Reagan challenged that. Reagan goes, it's not the bureaucrat just sits at his desk. Reagan told the story of a guy at the Bureau of Indian Affairs who was sobbing at his desk. And a man came up to him and said, what's up? He goes, my Indian died. And this was the Reaganite celebration of the entrepreneur. And if you talk to young entrepreneurs, Michael Dell and others, they will tell you that the Reaganite mood of optimism is what launched Microsoft in 1982 and Dell in the 80s and this whole technology boom. So, in short, Trump recognizes the great benefit of technology. But he also realizes that in a society, it's not fair for a whole bunch of people to gallop tremendously ahead while a whole bunch of hard-working people are left behind. What kind of American dream is it that only works for some people? If we're going to have ladders of opportunity, everybody should be able to see a ladder.